it's Elise. Today I wanted to have a little chat to you about fondant because I get so many questions about it. I had one of my friends the other day say she bought a packet and she just didn't know where to start. So I thought, you know what, troubleshooting your fondant. I've showed you on my channel how to make DIY fondant, so your own homemade marshmallow fondant, which tastes amazing and it's really easy to make. I've also done a video on how to colour your fondant and some storage tips and advice, but my friend asked me if I could do a video on going right back to basics from when you very first get it out of the packet. So fondant is basically like Play-Doh, and I know it scares a lot of people off in decorating. It's seen as like a professional's tool, but really if you can remember being 3 years old and playing with Play-Doh, you can work with fondant and it has so many uses. These are some examples of some different ways that you can incorporate fondant. You've got things like large cakes, wedding cakes, you've got figurines. There are so many possibilities. We've used it on cupcakes. You can stand it up and make it firm, or you can use it while it's soft. Right back to basics, when you first get your fondant out of your package, it looks like this. It sort of doesn't really look like anything terribly special, but it's not something that you can work with straight away. So whenever you open the packet, you need to knead your fondant. So just knead it between your hands for about 2 or 3 minutes. The heat from your hands is going to warm it up and it's going to soften it down to that really nice Play-Doh consistency. As you're kneading it, you're also just helping it to get rid of any cracks that are in the fondant. So you want to make sure that it's relatively smooth and then you can roll it out. Whenever you're rolling fondant, you want to apply just a sprinkle of corn flour or a little bit of pure icing sugar to your bench. You can also apply a little bit of that corn flour to your rolling pin just to stop your rolling pin from sticking to your fondant. Now, people often ask me if they can use something else to roll out their fondant, like flour or sugar or things like that. I recommend either corn flour, which is also cornstarch, or pure icing sugar. Plain flour is going to dry your fondant out and it's going to make it crack. And any other substance like a Crisco or something like that is going to change the texture of your fondant. So either cornstarch or pure icing sugar is my recommendation, and they're the only two products that I use. So you can see there, after a little bit of kneading, you've got like a really nice sort of a pliable, stretchy Play-Doh. The store-bought fondant, because I always get asked what it tastes like, the store-bought fondant is quite a bit sweeter than the marshmallow fondant. So your DIY marshmallow fondant literally tastes like marshmallows. Store-bought fondant is really sweet, but it's really delicious. And the idea with fondant is you don't need a lot of it. So I roll mine out really, really thin. There's nothing worse than a really thick, chunky coat of fondant on your cake. So make sure when you think about using it, you're only using it in small quantities so that the eating of your cupcake is just as nice as the presentation. Storing your fondant. Like Play-Doh, fondant dries out when it's exposed to the air, so you need to store it properly. I always wrap my fondant in a little bit of plastic wrap. So I just wrap it in just a regular bit of cling wrap and then I put it into a Ziploc bag. This gives it a double coat of protection from the air and it allows it to last a lot longer. If you're working with like a marshmallow fondant, I recommend storing it in the fridge and then bringing it out to room temperature just before you're going to work with it. That'll last you between 2 and 4 weeks in the fridge. Store-bought fondant, however, lasts about 12 months. So I normally put it in those Ziploc bags, and a lot of the times they come in these like funky buckets, so I stick them straight back in the buckets, which also helps to keep them airtight. You never want to refrigerate store-bought fondant. You always want to keep that at room temperature. Moisture is the enemy, particularly of store-bought fondant, but of all fondants in most cases. So if you put moisture or water onto fondant, it actually starts to eat into it and to break down the fondant. The only time that I recommend you use water with fondant is when you actually want to make the fondant glue something. So a tiny little dab of water on one section of the fondant, and less is more with the amount of water you use, allows you to stick another piece of fondant straight on top and acts like a little bit of glue. It kind of makes the surface of the fondant go a little bit sticky, and then the next piece just sticks on. When that sets, it's really well stuck. If you're looking to have fondant decorations set a little bit firmer and a little bit faster than usual, all fondant will dry out. So if I was to make, for example, one of our little 3-dimensional butterflies, that's going to take between 12 and 24 hours to completely dry. It'll stand up under its own weight and it's not going to absorb the moisture from any buttercream decorations that you might stick onto it or stick it onto. If you want that to get nice and firm and set in about 6 or so hours, there's a product on the market called either Tylose or CMC. It's a white powder and you add it to your fondant and it helps, I don't even know how, but it helps your fondant set really firm, really fast. And by really fast, I don't mean in 5 minutes, I mean in a few hours, but it's a few hours instead of a few days. So if you're planning on making one of my fondant decorations or any fondant decorations, people often ask me how far in advance they can make them. I recommend making your fondant decorations a few days, even a couple of weeks in advance. They're going to last for the longest time, so once they're set, you can get about 6 months out of a fondant decoration. Make sure that you store them in some sort of an airtight container after they've set, not before they've set. You need to let them set in just the fresh air at room temperature, but once they're fully set, you can pop them into an airtight container just so that you don't get any bugs or anything gross on them if you're planning on keeping them for an extended period of time. If you're going to colour fondant, and I have done a whole video on this, which I will link to down below, but I always recommend using a colour paste or a powder colour. You can use liquid. Everybody thinks that you can't, but you can. It just will change the consistency of the fondant a little bit. So it's actually going to make it a little bit stickier and a little bit harder to work with. You can balance that out by adding in just small amounts at a time of that pure icing sugar. You can add regular icing sugar that's not so pure, but that does sort of start to dry your fondant out a little bit. It will work, but if you're covering something like a massive cake, as you're rolling that fondant out, it's going to dry out a lot faster than just that straight fondant. Whenever I'm making my own decorations, smaller things, I love the DIY fondant, but if I'm ever covering something like a massive wedding cake, I always go with a pre-bought fondant. For some reason, the elasticity of them's better, they roll out better, and I seem to get less cracking and less, they call it elephant skin, where it all kind of sags a little bit around the edges. When it comes to coloring fondant, color it whatever color you like, but for your darker colors like your black, your dark green, and your red, just buy them pre-colored. You are going to need to add a ton of food coloring to even come close to like a dark gray or a reasonable color of green or a darkish pink. So I always recommend, they come in these little tubs, there's all different brands of them, and just get those 3 basic colors already pre-bought. Otherwise, all of your pastels, all of your other shades of colors, I just have a tub of white in the cupboard. It lasts for 12 months and I cut it off and I color it as I need to. Once you've colored that fondant, it still stores exactly the same as uncolored fondant. If you're trying to achieve a sort of a darker shade without that really black color, I did some navy blue the other day. Bear in mind that with fondant and buttercream, those colors will develop a little bit overnight. So if you're looking for a darker shade of blue, don't just keep on adding food coloring. If your food coloring is not making any difference, set it aside, let it sit overnight, and you'll probably wake up in the morning to find that it's kind of naturally darkened in color anyway. On that, if you know you need to add a fair bit of food coloring to the fondant, make sure you color it the day before. Once again, because we're adding food coloring, you are changing the texture, and because of all the kneading required to get that food coloring really well worked through that fondant, it's going to be a bit soft. So let it sit on the bench for 12 hours, it'll firm back up and it'll be a dream to work with. There's a ton of different brands on the market. For me, it really doesn't matter what you use. I've used Satin Eyes, I've used Bakel's, I've used Wilton, I've used so many different brands, and I haven't come across one yet that I really don't like working with, but they are all going to be a little bit different, and depending on your climate is going to depend on which brand of fondant works for you. I'm in a pretty humid environment, so I like brands that stand up a little bit more to the humidity. If you're in a really cold environment, you might want a softer fondant because it's not going to be as hard for you to knead when you first take it out of that icy cold cupboard. If you are battling the humidity or excessive moisture in the air, you can store your fondant decorations in a cupboard, just a kitchen cupboard, with one of those dehumidifying tubs that they give you to keep the mold and mildew out of like your cupboards and your wardrobes. It actually sucks the moisture out of the air and it kind of creates a little dry, safe environment for your fondant decorations. Particularly good if you know there's some bad weather coming. That's just some of my hints and tips for dealing with fondant. So when you get it, don't be afraid to use it. The key thing is just to give it a bit of a knead so that it's easy to work with, and make sure that you flour your surface with that corn flour or with that pure icing sugar so you're not getting a sticky mess. Otherwise, guys, you are working with sweet sugary Play-Doh. Thanks very much for tuning in to My Cupcake Addiction.